The massive station turned slowly in the void of space, and its lights flickered against the darkness like tiny stars. Nexus Prime had stood at the center of galactic politics for over 1,000 years, and today it would witness something that would change the course of history forever. Ambassador Hyan Wu walked through the long corridors of the station with steady steps. His black uniform was simple but well-fitted, and the small patch on his shoulder showed the blue and white colors of Earth. Other beings moved past him in the hallways, and some watched him with curious eyes, while others simply ignored the human. The Galactic Council chamber was huge with seats arranged in circles that went up toward the ceiling. Hundreds of different species sat in their assigned places, and the air, filled with the sounds of breathing apparatus and translation devices, working to help everyone understand each other. Hyan Wu took his seat in the section marked for newer species and looked around at the familiar faces he had come to know over his 3 years as Earth's voice in this place. At the center of the chamber stood Elder Zix, and the ancient crystalline being glowed with a soft blue light that had dimmed very little over his many centuries of life. His voice carried easily through the vast space when he spoke, and every creature in the room could hear him clearly without any help from machines. The Council recognizes Warlord Kethmore of the Velthran Empire, Elder Zix announced, and his tone held the weight of age and experience. Kethmore stood up from his seat, and his massive frame cast shadows on the floor below him. The Velthran was tall and broad, with thick gray skin that looked like it could stop bullets and small red eyes that burned with constant anger. His people were known throughout the galaxy as warriors, who solved problems with violence first and questions later. The warlord's voice boomed across the chamber when he began to speak. Elder Zix and members of this council, I come before you today to announce the expansion of Velthran territory into the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, Kethmore said, and his words carried the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. The systems in question are currently claimed by the species that calls itself human, but they are a young race with limited military capability, and we do not expect any significant resistance to our rightful expansion. Several beings in the chamber shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and whispered conversations began in various languages throughout the room. Hyanwu remained perfectly still, and his face showed no emotion as he listened to the warlord's declaration. His hands rested calmly on the armrests of his chair, and his breathing stayed steady and controlled. Elder Zix's glow brightened slightly, and he turned his ancient gaze toward the Velthran section of the chamber. Warlord Kethmore you speak of. Expansion into territory already claimed by another member species of this council, he said, and his voice carried a note of warning that few beings had ever heard from the usually neutral elder. Such actions require careful consideration of all consequences. Kethmore laughed, and the sound echoed off the chamber walls like thunder. What consequences could there be from a species that has barely learned to travel between stars? He said, and gestured dismissively in Hyan Wu's direction. The humans have existed in space for less than 50 of their years, while my people have conquered worlds for over 1,000. They possess perhaps 200 warships, while the Velthran Empire commands over 5,000 vessels of war. This is not a battle, but merely the collection of resources that belong to the strong. Other members of the council began to murmur among themselves, and some looked toward Hyan Wu with expressions that might have been pity or curiosity. The human ambassador slowly stood from his seat, and every eye in the chamber turned toward him. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast room. Warlord Kethmore speaks correctly about the size of our respective fleets, Hyanwu said, and his tone remained completely calm. Humanity is indeed new to the stars, and we have much to learn about galactic civilization. We came to this council seeking peaceful relationships with our neighbors, and we have tried to be good members of this community. We prefer peace in all our dealings, but we are prepared for alternatives if peace proves impossible. Kethmore's red eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward in his seat. Are you threatening the Velthran Empire, human? He growled, and his massive hands clenched into fists. I am stating a simple fact, Hyunwoo replied, and he remained standing while looking directly at the warlord. Humanity desires peace above all else, but we will defend ourselves if attacked. We hope that wisdom will guide all decisions made in this chamber today. Elder Zix's glow suddenly became much brighter, and the ancient being's voice filled the chamber with a power that made every creature present fall silent. "Warlord Kethmore, I must speak directly to you now," he said, and his tone carried the weight of millennia. "I have observed the rise and fall of countless species across this galaxy, and I have seen wars that lasted centuries and conflicts that consumed entire star systems. I have watched civilizations destroy themselves and others grow beyond all expectations." The elder's crystal form turned toward Kethmore, and his light pulsed with each word. "I have studied the humans since they first achieved faster than light travel, and I have read their histories from before they reached the stars. I tell you this now as clearly as I can speak it. Do not attack the humans because they will never let you flee." A strange silence fell over the entire chamber, and even the background hum of life support systems seemed to grow quiet. Kethmore stared at the ancient being with disbelief written across his features, while other council members looked between the elder and the human ambassador with growing concern. "Elder Zix speaks in riddles," Kethmore said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "What possible threat could this young species pose to an empire that has conquered half the outer rim?" Elder Zix's glow dimmed slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried sadness that seemed to come from the very depths of time. "Other species fight until they achieve their goals or until the cost becomes too high to bear," he said, and his words fell like stones into still water. "The humans are different in ways that most beings cannot understand. When you attack them, they do not simply fight back, and they do not stop when victory becomes unlikely. They remember every injury, and they pursue every enemy with a determination that defies all logic." The elder turned toward the center of the chamber, and his light swept across the assembled beings. "I have seen their wars from before they reached the stars, and I have watched how they respond to threats against their people. They do not fight for territory or resources or glory like other species. They fight for each other with a fury that burns longer than stars. And when they begin such a fight, they do not stop until every enemy has been found and dealt with completely." Kethmore rose from his seat again, and his anger had returned in full force. "You ask me to fear a species with 200 ships because of ancient stories and mystical warnings," he shouted, and his voice carried across the chamber. "The Velthran Empire has never retreated from any battle, and we will not be intimidated by prophecies from a crystal fortune teller." The warlord gestured sharply toward his delegation, and they began to file out of the chamber, while other council members watched in stunned silence. As Kethmore reached the exit, he turned back toward Hyanwu, and his red eyes blazed with contempt. "Your people have 7 days to abandon the outer colonies, human," he called across the chamber. "After that, they become subjects of the Velthran Empire, whether they choose it or not." When the Velthrons had left, Elder Zix approached Hyanwu, and the ancient being's glow had dimmed to barely visible levels. "Ambassador, I fear that my warning has fallen on deaf ears," he said, and his voice carried deep regret. "May I ask what your government's response will be to this threat?" Hyanwu looked toward the exit where Kethmore had disappeared, and for the first time since the session began, his calm expression changed slightly. Something cold and hard appeared in his eyes for just a moment before disappearing again behind his diplomatic mask. "My government will respond as it always has when our people are threatened," he said quietly. "We will defend ourselves with every resource at our disposal, and we will not stop until the threat no longer exists." Elder Zix studied the human ambassador for a long moment, and his ancient mind tried to process what he saw in those briefly revealed depths. "I hope for all our sakes that Warlord Kethmore reconsiders his position," he said finally, "because I fear that what comes next will change this galaxy forever." The morning sun rose over New Busan Colony, and its light painted the metal buildings gold while children played in the streets between the prefab homes their parents had built with their own hands. Captain Lee So-jin stood at the window of the defense headquarters and watched the peaceful scene below with eyes that had seen too many battles in her 40 years of life. The colony had grown much in the 5 years since the first settlers arrived, and what started as a few emergency shelters had become a real town with schools and shops and parks where families gathered on quiet evenings. So-jin had been born on Earth, but this place felt like home in ways that her birth world never had, and she would die before letting anyone harm the people who lived here. Her communication device chirped and she answered it without taking her eyes off the children below. Defense Command, this is Captain Lee. Captain, we have multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, came the voice of Lieutenant Park from the sensor station. Configuration matches Velthron Heavy Cruiser class and there are a lot of them. Sojin felt ice form in her stomach, and she turned away from the window toward the tactical display that dominated the center of the command room. Red dots appeared. On the screen, like drops of blood, and more kept materializing as the sensors tracked incoming ships. The numbers climbed steadily and did not stop until 43 vessels showed on the display. How long until they reach orbit? Sojin asked, and her voice stayed calm despite the fear that tried to crawl up her throat. At current speed, approximately 6 hours, Captain, Lieutenant Park replied. Should I begin civilian evacuation procedures? Sojin looked at the numbers on the screen and did quick calculations in her head. New Busan had 80,000 people living on the surface, and the colony. Transport ships could carry maybe 10,000 in a single trip if they packed people like cargo. The nearest human system was 18 hours away at maximum speed, and that assumed the transports could get past the Veltron fleet without being destroyed. Begin evacuation immediately, she ordered. Priority goes to children and families. Get everyone you can off this rock, but do not panic the civilians. Tell them this is a precautionary drill and keep them calm. The next few hours passed like a nightmare that moved in slow motion. Sojin coordinated the evacuation, while her small force of 12 defense fighters and 2 patrol boats prepared for a battle they could not possibly win. The civilian transports loaded people as fast as safety would allow and launched toward the outer system where they hoped to jump to hyperspace before the enemy arrived. Dr. Choi Min-ho worked at the Xenobiology Research Station and helped load critical data files onto the departing ships, while his hands shook with adrenaline and fear. He had studied many alien species including the Velthrons, and he knew exactly what their arrival meant for everyone who could not escape in time. His research included detailed information about Velthron military tactics and their treatment of conquered populations, and none of it gave him any reason for hope. Commander Jang Ye-yoon managed the evacuation flights from the spaceport, and her voice crackled over the communications system as she guided ship after ship toward safety. Transport 7. You are cleared for departure. Transport 8, begin loading procedures at Bay 3. All civilian vehicles stay clear of the flight corridors. The Velthron fleet arrived exactly when predicted, and their ships filled the sky like storm clouds. The lead vessel was massive beyond anything the colonists had ever seen, and it bristled with weapons that could reduce the entire colony to ash within minutes. Sojin watched from her command center as the enemy ships took positions around the planet and blocked every possible escape route. A communication signal came from the flagship and Sojin accepted it on the main screen. Warlord Kethmore appeared in the display and his red eyes burned with satisfaction as he looked down at the human captain. Captain Lee Sojin of the New Busan Defense Force, he said, and his voice filled the command center. I am Warlord Kethmore of the Velthron Empire, and I claim this world and all its inhabitants in the name of my people. You will surrender immediately and order all civilian transports to return to the surface for processing. Sojin looked at the warlord and her face showed no fear despite the impossible odds she faced. Warlord Kethmore, this colony is the sovereign territory of the human government and its people are under our protection. You have no legal claim to this world under galactic law. Kethmore laughed, and the sound echoed through the communication link. Legal claim means nothing without the power to enforce it, human. You have 12 small fighters and 2 patrol boats while I command 43 ships of war. Surrender now and your people will be treated according to the conventions of warfare. Resist and they will suffer the consequences of your stubbornness. The people of New Busan are not your people, and they never will be. Sojin replied, and her voice grew harder with each word. If you want this colony, you will have to take it. The first shots came without warning and Velthron missiles streaked down from orbit like falling stars. Sojin's fighters launched from their hidden positions and climbed toward the enemy fleet, while the 2 patrol boats tried to draw fire away from the evacuation transports. The small human ships moved like angry insects around the massive Velthron vessels, and their weapons fired continuously at targets too large to miss. Lieutenant Park reported from his station while explosions lit up the sky outside the command Center windows. Transport 12 has cleared the gravity well, Captain. Transports 13 and 14 are still climbing to jump altitude. Fighter Squadron Alpha is engaging the enemy screening force, but we are taking heavy casualties. So-Jin watched her fighters die one by one on the tactical display, and each red light that disappeared represented a pilot she had known personally. Some had been her students at the academy, and others had served with her for years on various assignments. Now they threw their lives away in a hopeless battle to buy minutes for the civilian transports. The orbital bombardment began after the human fighters were destroyed, and energy beams lanced down from the Veltran ships to strike military targets across the colony. The defense headquarters shook under the impact of nearby explosions, and dust fell from the ceiling. While the lights flickered and emergency systems activated throughout the building, Dr. Choi had remained behind to help with the final evacuations, and he worked frantically to save what research data he could while buildings burned around him. His studies of Veltran biology might prove useful to human forces somewhere else, and he uploaded everything to a secure server that would transmit the information to Earth before the enemy could capture it. Commander Yang guided the last transport ship off the surface while Veltran fighters strafed the spaceport around her. Transport 15, you are clear to depart, she called over the radio. Godspeed, and tell them what happened here. The final phase of the battle lasted only 30 minutes and ended when Veltran ground forces landed at strategic points around the colony. So-Jin and her remaining personnel fought from the command bunker until their ammunition ran out and enemy soldiers breached the blast doors with cutting tools and explosives. So-Jin activated the emergency communication system one last time, and her voice transmitted across subspace to the human fleet headquarters 18 light-years away. This is Captain Lee So-Jin of New Busan Defense Command. The colony has fallen to Veltran forces and civilian casualties are heavy. We held them for as long as we could. Tell them we held the line. Tell them what they have done. The transmission ended when a Veltran soldier shot out the communication equipment, and So-Jin raised her hands in surrender. Around her, the few surviving members of her command staff did the same, and they were forced to watch as enemy troops began rounding up the civilians who had not escaped on the transport ships. The same scene played out on Terra Nova and Harmony. Stationed as Veltran forces struck all 3 human colonies simultaneously in a coordinated assault designed to force immediate surrender through overwhelming shock. The attacks were swift and brutal, and they left nearly 1 million human civilians dead or captured across the 3 worlds. Admiral Park Dong-hyun received the reports at Fleet Command headquarters, and his calm expression did not change as he read the casualty figures and battle summaries. His aide watched nervously as the Admiral sat in silence for several long minutes while processing the information that would change everything. "Sir, what are your orders?" the aide asked quietly. "Admiral." Park looked up from the reports, and his eyes held something that made the younger officer step back involuntarily. "Send a message to all fleet commanders," he said, and his voice carried the coldness of space itself. "Full mobilization begins immediately. Every ship and every crew is to report for active duty within 72 hours. The aide began to leave, but the Admiral's voice stopped him at the door. "Also send a message to the Veltran Empire through official diplomatic channels." "What should the message say, sir?" Admiral Park turned back to his reports, and when he spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. "Tell them they have made a grave error in judgment. Tell them to prepare themselves for the consequences of their actions." The message was transmitted within an hour, and it reached Warlord Kethmore aboard his flagship as his forces consolidated control of the 6 months had passed since the Veltran attack, and the galaxy had grown quieter in a way that made many species nervous. The expected human counterattack never came, and some began to whisper that humanity had accepted defeat and would seek peace through negotiation. Those whispers were wrong, and the beings who spoke them did not understand what was actually happening in the darkness between the stars. Captain Nam Tae-young sat in the command chair of his ship and watched the sensor display show empty space around him. The vessel was small and painted black, and its hull absorbed energy signatures that would have made it visible to most detection systems. His crew of 12 specialists had trained for operations like this one for their entire military careers, and they moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who knew that mistakes meant death. "Target acquired," Captain reported, Lieutenant Shin Bora from the navigation station. Veltran supply convoy bearing 27 Mark IV. 3 cargo vessels with light escort. Estimated cargo includes weapons and medical supplies for the occupation forces on Terra Nova. Nam studied the tactical display and calculated distances and firing solutions, while his crew prepared their weapon systems for combat. The convoy was exactly where human intelligence had predicted it would be, and it followed the same route that 17 previous supply runs had used over the past 4 months. The Velthrons were creatures of habit, and that predictability would cost them dearly. "All stations report ready, Captain," said the weapons officer. "Missiles armed and torpedo tubes loaded. We have firing solutions on all targets. Commence attack," Nam ordered, and his voice carried no emotion despite the violence he was about to unleash. "Destroy the cargo vessels first, then deal with the escorts. Remember that we want no survivors to report what they saw here." The missiles launched silently through space and struck their targets before the Velthron crews knew they were under attack. The cargo ships exploded in brilliant flashes that lit up the darkness for brief moments, before fading back into nothing. The escort vessels tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by weapons they could not see until it was too late. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, and when it ended, only debris remained where the convoy had been. Nam's ship collected some pieces of wreckage for intelligence purposes, then disappeared into hyperspace without leaving any trace of its presence. The attack would not be discovered for another 6 hours when the convoy failed to report its arrival at the scheduled checkpoint. Similar scenes played out across Veltron space as human ships struck supply lines and isolated outposts with surgical precision. The attacks followed no pattern that enemy intelligence could detect, and they came from directions that should have been impossible for human forces to reach. Mining stations went silent, communication relays stopped transmitting, and patrol ships simply vanished without sending distress signals. Intelligence Officer Yoon Hana worked from a secure facility deep beneath the surface of Mars, and her team monitored Velthron communications across dozens of star systems. They intercepted military traffic and civilian broadcasts, and analyzed everything for useful information about enemy movements and morale. What they discovered painted a picture of growing fear and confusion within the Velthron Empire. "The enemy is beginning to realize that something unusual is happening," Yoon reported to her superiors during the weekly briefing. "Their local commanders are requesting additional escorts for supply runs, and some have asked for permission to change their established routes. More importantly, their communications show increasing anxiety about the nature of these attacks." Admiral Park listened to the report from his office at Fleet Command and nodded approval at what he heard. The psychological aspect of the campaign was just as important as the physical damage being inflicted on Velthron infrastructure. Fear was a weapon that could be more effective than missiles when used correctly. "Continue monitoring their communications," he ordered. "I want to know everything they say about these attacks, and I want our people to hear their fear. Also begin implementing Phase 2 of the psychological operations. It is time to let them know exactly who is hunting them." Phase 2 began the next day when Velthron communication networks across the Outer Rim started receiving unauthorized transmissions that overrode their secure channels. The messages were simple and appeared in perfect Velthron language, accompanied by images of the destroyed colonies and recordings of the final transmissions from Captain So-Jin and the other defenders who had died protecting their people. "We remember New Busan," the messages said. "We remember Terra Nova. We remember Harmony Station. We are coming for you. There is no distance too far. There is no hiding place we cannot find. We are coming." The transmissions appeared at random intervals and could not be blocked or traced to their source. They played during military briefings and civilian entertainment programs, and even on the personal communicators of individual Veltron soldiers. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating, as the enemy began to understand that they were being hunted by an opponent unlike anything they had faced before. Engineer Kang Woo-jin worked in the research facilities on Luna and led the development of technologies that would make the hunt more effective. His greatest achievement was the persistence drive system that allowed human ships to track and follow enemy vessels across multiple hyperspace jumps. The technology was based on quantum resonance signatures that could not be masked or spoofed by conventional methods. The persistence drive works by creating a quantum entanglement between our ships and any target vessel that comes within scanning. Range Kang explained to the technical committee reviewing his work. Once the link is established, we can follow that ship anywhere in the galaxy, regardless of how many times it changes course or tries to hide. The implications of the technology were staggering, and they fundamentally changed the nature of space warfare. No enemy ship could escape once it had been marked for tracking, and no retreat could be truly successful as long as human forces maintained their pursuit. The Velthrons would discover this the hard way, when their attempts to withdraw damaged vessels to safe ports led human attackers directly to previously secret bases. Warlord Kethmore stood in the command center of his flagship and stared at the tactical display showing the locations of recent attacks on his supply lines. The pattern made no sense according to everything he knew about human military capabilities, and the coordination required for such widespread operations should have been impossible for a species with such a small fleet. "How many ships have we lost this month?" he demanded from his intelligence officer. 47 vessels destroyed or missing, sir," came the nervous reply. "Supply convoys are being hit almost daily, and our patrol routes are no longer safe. The attacks come from ships we cannot detect using weapons we have never seen before." Kethmore turned toward the communications station, and his red eyes burned with frustrated rage. "Send a message to the High Command. Request immediate reinforcement of all supply routes and authorization to begin evacuating non-essential personnel from the Outer Rim territories." The communications officer hesitated before responding to the order. "Sir, the High Command has already denied 3 previous requests for reinforcement. They believe that these attacks are being carried out by human special forces, using captured Velthron vessels, and that increasing our military presence would only provide more targets." "Then they are fools who do not understand what we are facing," Kethmore growled. "These are not random raids by desperate survivors. This is a systematic campaign designed to destroy our ability to maintain control of conquered territory. The humans are not behaving like any enemy we have fought before." The warlord was correct in his assessment, but he still did not fully understand the scope of what humanity had unleashed against his people. The attacks on supply lines were only the beginning of a campaign that would eventually encompass every aspect of Velthron military and civilian infrastructure. Human intelligence had spent months mapping the Empire's weaknesses, and now they were exploiting those vulnerabilities. With ruthless efficiency, Dr. Li Gayun worked in the weapons development laboratories on Europa, and her team created specialized munitions designed specifically for use against Velthron biology and technology. The weapons were not intended to cause unnecessary suffering, but rather to disable enemy personnel and equipment as efficiently as possible, while minimizing the risk to human forces conducting boarding operations. The neurological disruptor rounds will incapacitate Velthron subjects for approximately 6 hours without causing permanent damage, she explained during a demonstration for military officials. The electromagnetic pulse grenades are calibrated to disable their electronics while leaving human equipment unaffected. These tools will allow our boarding parties to capture intact vessels and facilities for intelligence gathering. The captured intelligence proved invaluable in planning future operations, and it revealed the locations of hidden bases and supply depots that had been unknown to human forces. Each successful raid provided more information that led to additional targets, and the cycle of destruction continued to expand throughout Velthron. Space Lieutenant Colonel Bae Sung-ho commanded the Special Forces units. 2 years had passed since the first human ships began their relentless pursuit of Velthron forces across the galaxy, and the empire that had once controlled hundreds of star systems was now a shadow of its former self. Supply lines that had operated for centuries lay in ruins, and military bases that had seemed impregnable were abandoned. Ruins filled with the ghosts of their former occupants. Colonel Bae Sung-ho stood in the ruins of what had once been a Velthron prison camp on the planet, Kepler 442b, and watched his medics tend to the human survivors they had liberated from the facility. The prisoners were thin and scarred, and their eyes held the haunted look of people who had endured things that no civilized being should ever experience. Some had been captured during the original attacks on the colonies, while others were civilians who had been taken from transports that failed to escape the initial assault. How many did we find alive? Bay asked his medical officer as she worked to stabilize a woman who could barely stand on her own legs. 47 survivors out of the 300 who were brought to this facility. Medic Park Sun-young replied without looking up from her patient. The records we recovered indicate that the others died from overwork, disease, or were executed when they became too weak to be useful. Sir, I have to tell you that some of these people may never fully recover from what was done to them, Bai felt. Anger burned in his chest like acid, but he kept his voice steady when he spoke. Document everything you find here. Every injury, every medical condition, every piece of evidence of what these animals did to our people. The galaxy needs to know exactly what the Velthrans are capable of when they think no one is watching. The TU liberation of the prison camps had revealed the full extent of Velthran brutality toward their human captives, and the evidence was being transmitted to every major news network and government archive across known space. The images and testimonies painted a picture of systematic cruelty that shocked even species that had considered themselves hardened to the realities of warfare. Commander Oji-wan coordinated the naval operations that had cornered 3 separate Velthran fleet remnants in dead-end star systems where they could neither advance nor retreat without facing human forces. The enemy commanders had requested permission to surrender multiple times, but each request had been denied with the same simple response: surrender will be accepted only at your homeworld. O told the latest Velthran delegation that attempted to negotiate safe passage through human lines. Your empire chose to attack our civilians, and now you will face the consequences of that decision until every one of your people acknowledges their crimes and accepts justice. The Velthran admiral who led the delegation was a scarred veteran named Vortuk, who had commanded fleets for over 30 years and had never faced an enemy like humanity. Commander, you must understand that we are trapped here with nowhere to go and insufficient supplies to maintain our forces indefinitely. Surely your people can show mercy to soldiers who were simply following orders. Looked at the alien officer, and her expression remained completely neutral. Admiral Vortuk, did your forces show mercy to the children at New Busan when they begged for their lives? Did they show compassion to the elderly civilians on Terra Nova when they pleaded for medical treatment? Your people created the rules of this conflict when they chose to target non-combatants, and now you must live by those same rules. The Velthran delegation left without reaching an agreement, and their fleet remained trapped in the Rigel system where human forces maintained a constant blockade. Similar situations existed in 7 other systems, where enemy survivors found themselves surrounded by opponents who refused to allow any escape or negotiation, short of total surrender. Dr. Lee Ga-eun had expanded her weapons research to include non-lethal systems specifically designed to incapacitate Velthran personnel without causing permanent harm. The development was part of a broader human strategy to capture as many enemy soldiers and officials as possible for war crimes tribunals that would be held after the conflict ended. The sonic disruptor field generators will render Velthran troops unconscious within 30 seconds of activation, she explained to the military commanders reviewing her latest designs. The effect is completely reversible and causes no lasting damage, but it allows our forces to secure prisoners without the risk of casualties on either side. We can also modify the frequency to affect their communication equipment while leaving. Ours unaffected. The new weapons proved highly effective during boarding operations against Velthran vessels, and they allowed human forces to capture intact ships along with their crews and cargo. The intelligence gathered from these operations revealed the locations of previously unknown enemy facilities and provided detailed information about Velthran military capabilities and strategic planning. Lieutenant General Ryu Hyejin commanded the ground forces that had occupied 17 former Velthran military installations across the Outer Rim, and her troops were discovering evidence of systematic atrocities committed by the enemy against not only humans but several other species as well. The documentation painted a picture of an empire that had built its power through the brutal subjugation of weaker civilizations. The evidence we are uncovering suggests that the attacks on our colonies were not an isolated incident, Ryu reported during a secure communication with Fleet Command. The Velthrans have been conducting similar operations against other species for decades, but none of their previous victims had the military capacity to respond effectively. "We may be fighting on behalf of more than just humanity," Admiral Park received the reports from his commanders across the active theater of operations and compiled them into a comprehensive assessment of the campaign's progress. The Velthran Empire was collapsing under the sustained pressure of human attacks, but its core worlds remained defended, and its leadership showed no signs of accepting responsibility for their actions. "The enemy is consolidating their remaining forces around their homeworld and the major industrial centers," Park told his senior staff during their weekly planning meeting. "Intelligence estimates suggest that they have perhaps 500 warships left out of the original 5,000, and most of those are damaged or operating with skeleton crews. However, their final strongholds will be heavily fortified and they will fight desperately to protect them." The Galactic Council had attempted to mediate the conflict on multiple occasions, but each effort had failed when human representatives refused to negotiate anything short of complete Velthran surrender and acceptance of war crimes charges. Ambassador Hyun Woo had made the human position clear during the most recent diplomatic session. The Velthran Empire opened this conflict by targeting civilian populations, and they will not be permitted to escape the consequences of their actions. Through political maneuvering, he told the assembled delegates, humanity seeks justice for the nearly 1 million innocent people who died in their unprovoked attacks, and we will accept nothing less than full accountability from those responsible. Elder Zix had watched the human campaign with a mixture of admiration and concern, and his ancient mind struggled to process the implications of what he was witnessing. The humans fight with a determination that exceeds anything I have observed in my long existence, he confided to other council members during a private session. They have demonstrated that they will pursue their enemies across the entire galaxy, and they will not be deterred by distance or time or the pleas of other species for moderation. Some council members had begun to express concern about the precedent being set by human actions, and they worried about the implications for galactic stability if other species adopted similar approaches to conflict resolution. However, attempts to impose sanctions or restrictions on human military operations had failed when several species that had previously been neutral declared their support for the human position. The crystalline hegemony released a statement that shocked many observers by its direct support for human actions. "The Velthran Empire has violated the most fundamental principles of civilized warfare by targeting non-combatants, and we applaud the human response as both proportionate and necessary. Let this serve as a warning to all species that such crimes will not be tolerated by the galactic community." Similar statements came from the Aquatic Federation and the Silicon Collective, and even some traditional Velthran allies began to distance themselves from the Empire as evidence of their atrocities became public. The diplomatic isolation added to the military pressure and made it clear that the Velthrans would find no sanctuary among the stars, no matter how far they ran. Warlord Kethmore had been recalled to the homeworld after losing most of his fleet to human attacks, and he now served as a military advisor to the High Command as they planned their final defense. The warlord who had once boasted of easy victory over a primitive species now spent his days studying tactical reports that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. "The humans have demonstrated capabilities that our intelligence services never predicted," he admitted during a strategy meeting with other senior officers. "Their ships can track our vessels across multiple hyperspace jumps, and their weapons technology has advanced beyond our ability to counter effectively." The human fleet that gathered at the edge of the Velthran home system was the largest military force that had ever been assembled in galactic history, and its ships stretched across space like a metal constellation that blocked out the stars. 3 years of total war mobilization had transformed humanity from a small, peaceful species into a military power that commanded the attention and respect of every civilization in known space. Admiral Park Dong-hyun stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the final ships take their positions in the massive formation that surrounded the enemy homeworld. The fleet contained over 2,000 vessels of all classes, from massive dreadnoughts that had been built specifically for this battle to small, fast attack craft that could strike at targets with surgical precision. All fleet elements report. "Ready for final operations, Admiral," reported his communications officer. "Ground forces are standing by for planetary assault, and our intelligence assets have confirmed enemy positions around the target world. The Velthrans have approximately 400 ships remaining, and they are deployed in a tight defensive Shell around their planet. Park nodded and activated the fleet-wide communication system that would carry his words to every human crew member participating in the final battle of the war. Warriors of Earth, this is Admiral Park speaking to you from the flagship of our combined fleet. Today we bring justice to those who attacked our people and murdered our innocent civilians. Today we prove to the galaxy that there are consequences for those who target the defenseless and that humanity protects its own, no matter how long it takes or how far we must travel. The Admiral paused and looked out at the enemy world that hung in space before them, like a gray pearl surrounded by the glittering lights of defensive installations. We did not seek this war, but we will finish it completely and thoroughly. We will show mercy to those who surrender, but we will show no quarter to those who continue to resist. The people of New Busan and Terra Nova and Harmony Station will be avenged today. Captain Lee So-jin commanded one of the assault cruisers in the forward battle line, and her ship bore the name New Busan Memorial in honor of the colony she had failed to save 3 years earlier. She had been rescued from Velthron captivity during the liberation of the prison camps and had spent months recovering from her injuries before returning to active duty. The scars on her body had healed, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. All weapons charged and ready, Captain, reported her tactical officer. Enemy defensive positions are marked and we have firing solutions on all priority targets. The crew is ready for combat operations. So-jin looked at the tactical display showing the Velthron fleet arranged in desperate defensive formations around their homeworld, and she felt no satisfaction at their obvious fear. Too many good people had died to bring them to this moment, and the price of victory had been paid in blood by civilians who never had a chance to defend themselves. Signal the fleet that New Busan Memorial is ready for final operations, she ordered. Today we collect the debt that is owed to our dead. The final battle began when Admiral Park transmitted the terms of surrender to the Velthron High Command one last time. The message was simple and direct, and it offered the enemy leaders a choice between accepting responsibility for their crimes or watching their civilization burn around them. Warlord Kethmore and members of the Velthron High Command, this is Admiral Park Dong-hyun of the Human Defense Force. The message began. You are surrounded by superior forces and your military situation is hopeless. I offer you one final opportunity to surrender unconditionally and face trial for war crimes committed against civilian populations. You have 30 minutes to respond before we begin final assault operations. The response came from Kethmore himself, and his image appeared on the main display of Park's flagship. The warlord looked older than he had during the original council session 3 years earlier, and his red eyes held the desperate fury of a trapped animal. Admiral Park, the Velthron Empire will never surrender to an inferior species that has no understanding of true warfare. We will fight to the last ship and the last warrior, rather than submit to your primitive concepts of justice. Park looked at the alien leader who had started this war with his arrogance and refused to end it with his wisdom. Very well, Warlord Kethmore, you have chosen your path. All fleet units commence final assault operations. Let us finish what you began. The human fleet moved forward like an unstoppable tide of metal and energy, and the space around the Velthron homeworld erupted in explosions and laser fire as the two forces clashed in desperate battle. The enemy fought with the courage of those who knew they were doomed, but their weapons could not penetrate human shields that had been designed specifically to counter Velthron technology. General Ryu Hee-jin commanded the ground assault forces that landed on the planet's surface while the space battle raged overhead. Her troops had trained for urban warfare in hostile territory, and they advanced through the enemy capital city with methodical precision, while loudspeakers broadcast surrender terms in the local language. Citizens of Veltar, you are not our enemies, and we do not wish to harm you, the broadcast declared. Remain in your homes and you will not be injured. Any civilian who assists military personnel or attempts to resist our forces will be considered a combatant and treated accordingly. Surrender to human forces, and you will be processed according to the laws of war. The Velthron military tried to organize defensive positions throughout the city, but human forces had studied their tactics for 3 years and knew exactly how to counter every strategy they attempted. Advanced weapon systems disabled enemy equipment, while non-lethal crowd control measures prevented civilian casualties during the building-by-building advance toward government centers. Dr. Li Gaun watched from the Fleet Command Center as her specially designed weapons performed exactly as predicted during the urban combat operations. The sonic disruptors rendered enemy soldiers unconscious without permanent harm, while electromagnetic pulse generators disabled their equipment and communication systems. Human forces could advance through defended areas with minimal casualties. On either side, the non-lethal systems are working perfectly, Admiral, she reported to Park as they monitored the ground assault. Our troops are able to neutralize resistance while preserving enemy personnel for interrogation and trial. Civilian casualties are minimal, and most of the population appears to be cooperating with occupation forces. The space battle ended when the last Velthron warship was disabled by overwhelming firepower, and its crew surrendered rather than face complete destruction. The enemy fleet that had once terrorized the Outer Rim territories was now nothing but floating debris and lifeboats, carrying survivors who would face justice for their crimes. Ambassador Haiyan Wu arrived aboard one of the transport ships that brought diplomatic personnel to oversee the formal surrender ceremony. He had represented humanity during the original council session where this conflict began, and it was fitting that he should be present when it finally ended. The man who had warned of consequences was here to see those consequences delivered. The surrender took place in the ruins of the Velthron High Command building, where human forces had captured the surviving members of the government that had ordered the attacks on civilian colonies. Warlord Kethmore knelt before Admiral Park with his hands bound and his eyes filled with the bitter knowledge of complete defeat. I hereby surrender all remaining Velthron military forces to human command, Kethmore said, and his voice carried none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier statements. I acknowledge the authority of human forces to occupy our territory and to conduct trials for alleged war crimes committed during this conflict. Park looked down at the alien leader who had dismissed humanity as weak and primitive, only to discover too late that he had awakened a sleeping giant. Warlord Kethmore, you are under arrest for crimes against sentient beings, including the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and the systematic murder of prisoners of war. You will be tried according to galactic law, and if found guilty, you will face appropriate punishment. The formal surrender ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, and it marked the end of the most decisive military campaign in recorded galactic history. A species that had been considered minor players in galactic politics had demonstrated that they possessed both the capability and the will to pursue their enemies to total defeat when their people were threatened. Elder Zix arrived aboard a council observation vessel to witness the conclusion of the conflict he had tried to prevent 3 years earlier. The ancient being's crystal form glowed with subdued light as he surveyed the devastation that surrounded the Velthron homeworld and contemplated the implications of what had transpired. Ambassador Haiyan Wu must speak with you about what has happened here, Zix said as they stood together in the occupied capital city. Your species has fundamentally changed the nature of galactic warfare and established precedents that will influence conflict resolution for generations to come. Yan Wu looked at the crystalline entity who had warned against attacking humanity, and whose words had been ignored with such catastrophic results. Elder Zix, humanity sought only peace when we first came to the council. In